Was silence. And I lean forward and say confidentially, in meetings like this, it's very often difficult to ask the first question. So I'll take the second question. The offer's open. Karen.
Can you tell us the title of the next book in the series?
The next book in the series is, yes, it's Fingal O'Reilly, Irish Doctor. So it's got Irish and Doctor in it. I can't work in Irish country. Irish student doctor is set half between the northern village and half between the slums of Belfast, and boy is that a contract, in the 30s. Do you know there were more people per capita in Dublin living in squalor than there were in New Delhi, India in the 1930s? 14 people to one room was not unusual. Tuberculosis was rampant. And that spoiled your lovely evening, hasn't it? Anyway, so that part of the book tells O'Reilly's studenthood. Because people keep writing and saying, well, how did this man get to be who he is? I have no idea. I put him on the word processor and he keeps telling me. I just let him loose. So having finished the wedding and received positive feedback about the student doctor book, I thought, well, I'll do another split book and I'll do half of it set in Dublin after O'Reilly graduates and goes into practice, and half of it set immediately after Country Wedding ends. So I'm answering questions for the readership all the time. It's giving the guy who does the covers hell. It's easy enough to do this and call it, an Irish country doctor. What do you do when half of it's in Dublin and half of it's in the north of Ireland? You put a diamond up the middle and two different colours. Dorothy came up with a bright idea. I suggested to the artist that he set it in a public house, because there are pubs in both north and south of the border. Think about it. The one I'm working on at the moment has got me excited, and it won't be for 2014. But old O'Reilly was a naval surgeon during the Second World War. Probably the most famous British battleship ever to put to sea after Lord Nelson's victory, called HMS Warspite. So the one I'm clacking the keys on at the moment for 2014 will deal with that particular episode. Okay, how are we doing? No. Yes.
So are you, you're a researcher, right? Or you were?
I was.
And were you a family practitioner at some time?
No.
So how did you get interested in writing about that?
Oh, was I a family? It's one of those, I'm a bit like a computer, you know. I used to have a navigational computer and I'd put in waypoints and punch in go to. Damn thing would say hell. You asked me, was I a general practitioner? Yes, I was. But it wasn't my career.
In Ireland?
In Ireland, yeah. A lot of us, when we graduated and we were doing our postgraduate work, it didn't pay worth a damn. And so we did evening surgeries, offices for GPs, weekends, summer locums. And I did that all over the north of Ireland to make ends meet, and that's where I got some of this stuff, okay? Mm-hmm. And actually, I got my start on some of this by writing a monthly column for a humour magazine called Stitches. And it's different from these books. These books are told in point of view, either O'Barry or O'Reilly. Mm-hmm. I chose to tell the columns third person, omniscient narrator, and cast myself as the straight man. Now, I promise you in the books I'm not Barry Laverty. If you cast yourself as a straight man in a funny story, you can make asides and they're not intruding on the story. So this is one of the early ones, and this one is for you, Nick. It's called The Lazarus Manoeuvre. It's called How Young Dr. O'Reilly Earned the Respect of His Community. We were sitting in the upstairs lounge of Dr. O'Reilly's house at the end of the day. Himself was tucking contentedly into his second large whisky. So he demanded, "How do you like it?" Being a little uncertain of whether he was asking about the spectacular view through the bay window to Belfast Lough, the small sherry I was sipping, or the general status of the universe, I countered with an erudite, "What?" I thought the conversation could become mildly repetitive and decided to broaden the horizons. How do I like what, Dr. O'Reilly? He extracted his digit and examined the end with all the concentration and knitting of brows of a gorilla evaluating a choice mortal. Practice here, you idiot. How do you like it? My lights went on. Fine, I said, as convincingly as possible. Just fine. My reply seemed to satisfy. He grinned, grunted, hauled his 180 pounds erect, wandered over to the sideboard and returned carrying the sherry decanter. He topped up my glass. A bird, he said, cannot fly on one wing. I refrained from observing that if he kept putting away the whisky at his usual rate, he'd be giving a pretty fair imitation of a mono-winged albatross in a high gale, but refrained from comment. He returned the decanter, ambled to the window, and took in the scenery with one all-encompassing wave of his arm. I'd not want to live anywhere else, he said. Mind you, it was touch and go at the start. He was losing me again. What was Dr. O'Reilly? Fingal, my boy, he said. Fingal, for Oscar. He gave me one of his most avuncular smiles. I couldn't for the life of me see him having been named for a small gilded statuette given annually to movie stars. Oscar Fingal? I asked. He shook his head. No, not Oscar Fingal, Wilde. He did this to me. Every time I thought I was following him, he changed tack, leaving me in a state of confusion bordering on that usually felt by people recovering from an overdose of chloroform. Oscar Fingal, Wilde Fingal? I should have stuck with Dr. O'Reilly. I could tell by the way the tip of his bent nose was beginning to whiten. He was becoming exasperated. He shook his head. Oscar, Fingal, O'Flaherty, Wills, Wilde. I stifled the urge to remark, if you put an air to it, you could sing it. He must have seen my look of bewilderment. The pallor left his nose. I was named for him. I was named for Oscar Wilde. The scales fell from my eyes. I see, I said. Good, he said. Now, where was I? You said it was touch and go at the start. Oh yes, getting the practice going. Touch and go. He sat again in the big comfortable armchair, picked up his glass of whisky and looked at me over the brim. Did I ever tell you, he asked, how I got started? No, I said, settling back in my own chair and preparing myself for another of his reminiscences, another wander down the byway of O'Reilly's life. He said, I came here in the early 40s. I took over from old Dr. Flanagan. I hoped fervently that we weren't about to embark on the genealogy of James Joyce, and was relieved to hear O'Reilly continue, he was a funny old bird. Never, I thought to myself, but kept the thought firmly to myself. O'Reilly was warming up. Just before he left, Finnegan warned me about a local condition of cold groin abscesses, swelling in the fold between the thigh and the belly. He explained to me that he lanced them, cut into him with a scalpel, and he either got wind or feces, and the patient always died. I was horrified. My mentor's predecessor had been incising hernias. That's why I was touch and go, O'Reilly said. My first patient had the biggest hernia I'd ever seen. When I refused to lance it like good old Dr. Flanagan, the patient spread the word that I didn't know my business. He sat back and crossed one leg over the other. Did you ever hear of Lazarus? Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde Lazarus, I asked. Don't you be impertinent, he said. He grabbed my by now empty glass and headed back to the sideboard. The delivery of a fresh sherry signaled he had not been offended. Not he. The biblical fellow that Jesus raised from the dead, he said. Yes, I said. That's how I got my start. Was it the sherry? Was I truly losing my mind? I was in church one Sunday, hoping that if the citizens saw I was a good Christian, they might look upon me more favourably. The thought of a pious O'Reilly seemed a trifle incongruous. There I was when a farmer in the front pew let out a yell like the banshee, grabbed his chest and keeled over. To add to the drama, O'Reilly stood arms wide. I took out of my pew like a whippet, examined. Mutton. Dead as mutton. I knew CPR hadn't been invented back then, so I said incredulously, "What did you do?" O'Reilly lowered his arm and winked. I got my bag, told everyone to stand back, and I gave the poor corpse an injection of whatever came handy. I listened to his heart. "He's back," says I. "He's back." You should have heard the gasp from the congregation. He sat down and I listened. "God," says I, "he's going again," and I gave the poor bugger another shot. O'Reilly sipped his drink. Altogether, he says, I brought him back 3 times before I finally confessed defeat. Innocence is a remarkable thing. "Did you really get his heart started?" I asked. O'Reilly guffawed. "Not at all," he said. But the poor benighted audience didn't know that. Do you know, I actually heard one woman saying to her neighbour, "The Lord only brought Lazarus back once, and the new doctor did it 3 times. He headed to the sideboard again. "I told you it was touch and go at the start, but the customers started rolling in after that."